I want to begin by echoing some of the things that were said this morning by people who paid tribute to the book. It's a book of just colossal ambition. It's challenging from the beginning to the very end, and I'm just delighted to have been invited to come here and participate in the celebration and examination of the book and in the tribute to the book's author. Because I'm a lawyer, Jim Fleming asked me if I would serve on the panel on interpretation, and I'm delighted to be on this panel because Professor Dworkin uses the term interpretation in a way much broader than most lawyers would. I found myself reading the book, spending a fair amount of time struggling with exactly what some of his claims mean, and in the paper, the short paper that I've produced, the principal claim that I'm struggling with and trying to unpack is the claim that moral and ethical reasoning are not only species of interpretation, but they're species of conceptual interpretation. So what I take that to mean is that when people encounter moral issues, and not just issues about what are the meaning of large moral concepts, such as justice, liberty, equality, and democracy, but when they encounter ordinary moral problems, what people ought to be doing is trying to figure out what to do by refracting their analysis of the situation or the problem through a large and wide a web of pertinent concepts as anybody possibly could do. This mode of reasoning, if I've got it right, is a mode of reasoning to conclusions in particular cases that is different from a kind of reflective equilibrium methodology that works directly back and forth between big moral principles and outcomes in particular cases in its insistence that concepts should be at the center of the analysis. For me, this account is interesting, challenging, may well be right at the end of the day, but it presents a number of puzzles that I try to talk about in my paper. But what I want to focus on today is one particular puzzle, and that is the puzzle for me about how the claim that moral and ethical reasoning are species of conceptual interpretation relates to the thesis that Dworkin presents as his unity of values thesis. What does it mean to say that values are one, that our values are in some interesting and important sense unitary? And at the end of the day, at the end of this 10 minutes, the suggestion that I want to make is that it may well be the case that the one big thing the hedgehog claims to know, which is that our values are in some sense unitary, may require supplementation by some of the many little things, the particularistic knowledge that foxes purport to provide. So to get the discussion going, I think it's helpful to imagine a case in which a friend that I believe has written a badly reasoned and poorly written book comes to me and says, "What do you think of the book? Do you think that the book is good?" So if I start to think about this case, refracting it through concepts, two of the concepts that would immediately spring to mind for me would be honesty and kindness. And my immediate reaction would be to think on the surface, it would be impossible for me to be both honest with the friend and kind to the friend. Concept of friendship and many other values may come into play, but for now I just want to focus on kindness and honesty. And so what should I do, and how should the answer to what I should do, the question what I should do, relate to the unity of values thesis? Now, on one interpretation, I'm going to give you three possible interpretations of the unity of values thesis. On one possible interpretation, the unity of values thesis would assert that there can be no conflict among genuine values even in their application. And so if I think I've got a conflict here between honesty and kindness, what I should do is to work hard on my conceptual analyses of these two concepts, maybe to do what is honest is not really unkind. It might seem that way on the surface, but if I think the concepts through, maybe it's not. Maybe it's not untruthful if I say something that is harmless and will make the friend feel better and has no bad consequences in the world. I go back and forth and I try to work things out in such a way that there's no conflict between honesty and kindness, and if I haven't done so at the end of the day, I've failed because I have failed to reach an answer that accords with the one right answer thesis. When I began reading Justice for Hedgehogs and encountered the unity of values thesis, I assumed that that was what Dworkin was going to mean, dealing with large concepts, liberty, democracy, and equality. He has found no conflicts. But then when we get down to the quotidian cases, as he calls them, although he says that the methodology of conceptual interpretation applies. He also in one place suggests that there might be a circumstance in which it could be right to be cruel, and in another place talking about the relationship between thick and thin concepts. Maybe it's only the really big important concepts of right and wrong that can't conflict, and maybe there's some possible room for conflict between smaller concepts such as honesty and kindness. I'm not sure at the end of the day what Dworkin thinks. My own view is working hard, I can't bring myself to believe that there can be no conflicts between values, genuine values such as honesty and kindness in application. So then suppose we look for other interpretations of the unity of values thesis. On a second interpretation, which I would call an interpretation insisting that there are no conflicts in principle among genuine values, the unity of values thesis would just insist that honesty and kindness are both important values in our overall web of beliefs. We can give accounts of what honesty and kindness are at very general levels that don't conflict with each other. We can give accounts of why they're both genuine values that don't conflict with each other, but there's no denial that they might conflict in application. Consistency in principle, possibility of conflict in application. Although this seems to me to be a possible interpretation of the unity of values thesis, I think it's clearly too weak for Dworkin, who wants to insist still on the one right answer thesis, because this would leave open the possibility that when values conflict, there's no right answer to what one ought to do. So then I come to the third possible interpretation, which would conjoin the notion that there is no inconsistency among values in principle with the one right answer thesis, and just insist that if, for example, kindness and honesty conflict in a particular case, there's one right answer discernible through analysis of our overall web of beliefs as to which value ought to prevail in the particular case. There are some reasons to think that Dworkin might be willing to accept this view. It's consistent with most of what he says. It fits with his general theory of interpretation, and it's strong enough to be controversial because of the one right answer element. But there are also some reasons to think that Dworkin might not be so comfortable with it. One of the reasons to think that is that this might be an interpretation of the unity of values thesis that many foxes could agree with. Their claim isn't that you can't give general accounts of concepts that are non-conflictual, but just that there are hard and possibly even tragic cases. The second reason that I'm not sure Dworkin would accept this is that it might have the following odd consequence to which I alluded at the beginning. If the Hedgehog's one big insight is that there is overall unity within our web of values, but that Hedgehog's one big insight doesn't either rule out the possibility of conflicts in values and application or tell us how conflicts in application ought to be resolved, then at the end of the day, there may be a large place for the fox and the insights of the fox to give us those particular answers to those particular questions. So at the end of the day, what I end with is a question. Does Dworkin, the hedgehog who wants to defend the hedgehog's position against the fox, at the end of the day need to embrace some foxes with fox-like insights to make his system go?
That was terrific. That's really terrific.